My name is Jim Doty. I'm the founder and director of CCARE. And one of our initiatives, besides research, focused on compassion and altruism and education and interventions. The educational aspect falls into a couple categories. One is we have seminars, we have conferences, we have workshops focused on compassion and altruism. And then one of the wonderful parts, actually one of the ones that I enjoy the most, are these events, which is the conversations on compassion, because as the Dalai Lama says, being compassionate is one of the few things which it's okay to be selfish, because when you give to others, you benefit yourself. And what I do is I have these meetings because in some ways I'm benefiting you by having these wonderful guests, but actually I'm selfishly benefiting myself. So I'm upfront about that at least. Tonight's guest is not only a friend, but really a person who I greatly admire by who he is on a multitude of levels. Probably many of you have read some, if not all, of Pico's books. He's an author of, I believe, well over a dozen books. He's also been a speaker at the Davos World Economic Forum on a few occasions. And I think he's one of the few people who's also received the award for the best spiritual anthologies, I think 7 times, and the best travel anthology 3 times, and also as well as one of the America's best writers. So really an extraordinary individual. I began my association with him, at least in the context of an author, with Video Nights in Kathmandu, but he's had other wonderful books, The Global Soul, The Lady and the Monk, and most recently, The Man Within My Head, based on his, I'm not sure if it's a virtual relationship with Graham Greene, but certainly a deep, close relationship with Graham Greene. The other interesting thing about Pico is that he's known the Dalai Lama and has traveled with him extensively, I think over 30 years. And his parents, in fact, I think were friends with His Holiness. And so he has an interesting perspective in regard to a very deep and close relationship with His Holiness. So without further ado, I think we'll begin this conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it, and I know I certainly am. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm embarrassed to be here because I haven't been performing surgery, and nobody has ever asked me to talk about compassion before, so I'm going to learn more from Jim than from anything I say. But.
Well, that's good then. I'm glad you're not practicing neurosurgery.
Yes, everybody else is too.
Actually, one of the things that has interested me is, you know, in your writings, your travel writings, there's oftentimes a component of spirituality in there, and there's a component of, I'm not sure if unsettledness is the right word, but I know you use the term ambiguity. But let's talk about, is this in part because of your own upbringing, in the sense that you went to English, I guess they call them public schools, and yet you ended up traveling a lot from age 8 onward because your parents had moved to California?
Yes, so you're right. I mean, I think very early on I felt that the only home I really had was inside, and that geography wasn't so important because I was going back and forth between, as you say, my parents' home in California and my schools in England, and therefore what I was rooted in was something invisible and portable that I carried with me. And when I was a little kid making that trip, I probably never expected that soon it would become the norm. You know, I was just talking to some students outside, and I think on this campus, probably I seem very static and boring in my background by comparison, that so many people now, especially among the young, are juggling many different kinds of homes and realizing that home is a work in progress and is something, a piece of soul, really, more than a piece of soil. And that home has much less to do with where you were born than where you become yourself. And so just willy-nilly I stumbled into that. And I think, to speak to the first part of your question, probably the more I move, the more I've seen the virtue of stillness. And the more I've realized that you can only begin to make sense of your movements by stopping and stepping back and putting them within a frame. I think the first thing you notice when you're a traveler is people who get caught up in the addiction of travel and lose a sense of their destination. They know where they don't want to be, but they don't always know where they want to be. And they know what they're fleeing from, but not always where they're going towards. And so you realize that travel is only as good as the clarity you bring to it. And therefore, the best travels come after you've really stayed in one place for a long time and thought about what you care deepest about, I suppose.
Well, it's sort of a metaphor in some ways for life. I mean, people stumble along in their lives and they don't know where they're going oftentimes, nor do they step back to think about where they want to go. They're just going.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say you have to spend some time at a place. Do you intentionally plan your travel so that you have the time to be at a place? I'll tell you, I travel a fair amount, and when I take my wife, she gets mad at me because I go, let's go here, let's go there, let's go there, let's go there in a week, and she says, I just want to sit here.
Yes. Your wife would get much madder at me because I'm the perfect example of how not to travel. I mean, I like you. I mean, I want to see as much as possible. I cover a lot of ground, and my great good fortune in life is I'm married to a Japanese person. So if I see 9 towns in 10 days, she says, "Why are we moving so slowly? Let's actually see the place. 15 towns in 11 days, much better." But actually, my traveling only takes up maybe 5% of my life. And because I'm sometimes described as a travel writer, I have to pretend I'm taking lots of trips. But in truth, I'm spending most of my time in rural Japan or in a monastery in Big Sur, where, of course, all my movement is inward. And we live in a 2-room rented flat in the middle of nowhere in Japan. We have no bicycle, no car. So really, for 7 months of the year, my whole life takes place within about a 4-square-block radius. And to me, that's actually the great adventure, because I've been lucky enough, as you have, to see lots of the places I most wanted to see. But it's also, I think when you're traveling, you need to travel to find out where the world is, what people are thinking, where they're going in their lives, to be stimulated and shaken out of your assumptions and reminded of how much you don't know. But then I think, as I was saying before, you really need to be in one place to recollect emotion and tranquility and to make sense of everything you've seen. And I think we've always had that need for stillness, and the stillness that complements the movement. But I feel ever more so now, in this age where we have email apnea and internet addiction disorder and nomophobia, which is literally the fear of being outside mobile phone contact. I think many of us have this sense of being in such an accelerated universe that something in us, almost in our bodies, is crying out for freedom from the movement. But it's interesting, because when we talk about all this, the great exemplar, of course, is the Dalai Lama, because I don't know anyone who has a more punishing travel schedule than he, and yet he's always absolutely at home and absolutely calm. And of course, the reason for that is waking up 3:30 in the morning and doing 4 hours of meditation before he even begins his day. And I think that's what allows him to navigate the world so impeccably.
Well, and I think he also finishes his day around 4:30 or 5.
Yes. So. In order to meditate more.
Right.
I remember once going in to talk to him in Dharamsala, and I was asking him about his spiritual practice. And he said, as he often does to people, well, because I've had all this temporal responsibility to lead Tibet into exile, I haven't had as much chance to devote myself to meditation and study as I would like to have otherwise. And then he described his day to me, waking up at 3:30 and then doing 4 hours of meditation and then taking care of administrative work and then having audiences and then taking care of his myriad other responsibilities. And nonetheless, I worked out every day 8 or 9 hours of meditation while being the busiest official person in the world. And it really humbled me that he'd said he didn't do enough, but his idea of not doing enough was 8 hours a day.
Right. Well, and what I have found amazing, and I think you probably have experienced this, is that he can recall events, people, names instantaneously, even after years and years of, I saw him recently and he recalled an event that happened a number of years ago, and it just really, I mean, he could tell like date, time.
It's amazing. Not so long ago, I was traveling with him and he said, "Oh, I remember the last time I saw your father, he was wearing a yellow shirt." The last time he'd seen my father was 23 years before that. And he's meeting 1,000 new people every day in the previous 7,000 days. And of course, he will look out on an audience like this and in the 6th row see somebody and say, oh, I remember seeing you in Lhasa in 1956. It's remarkable. And I've always wondered how much that's just his gift and how much it's his training.
His practice, right. Yeah. I don't know, but certainly I think that would be a good argument for anyone in this audience. If you want to maintain your mental health, just meditate 9 hours a day. Actually, it's interesting. You mentioned spiritual practice now, and you also mentioned that you spend part of your time in a monastery. What is your spiritual practice, if you don't mind me asking?
Really, none. Formally, you know, I'm an imposter at the CCARE Center because
I'm an imposter on many levels. So, yeah.
So I often think I've been lucky enough to be exposed to many traditions. My parents are Hindu, and my schooling was all Anglican, and I've lived for 25 years in deeply Buddhist Japan. And I once, feeling that I didn't know enough about Islam, spent maybe 6 or 7 years researching it and writing a whole novel about that. So I've been lucky enough to be guided by many of the traditions. But I haven't been so good about staking myself in any one of them. And if I were to say what I just said to His Holiness, he would say, wrong answer. Because I think the Tibetans famously say it's much better to dig one ditch 60 feet deep than 10 ditches 6 feet deep. So I'm an example of, again, of what not to do.
I have probably 100 ditches that are about 2 feet deep. So except maybe neurosurgery might be one that's a little deeper.
Well, exactly, that's a spiritual practice. And, you know, I often tell my friends, well, I've never, to my embarrassment and shame, I've never meditated. And again, if my wife were here, she would look at me and she'd fall around laughing and she'd say, all you do is meditate. Because, you know, I wake up, I go to my desk, I sit there in absolute stillness for 6 hours, I take a walk around the block, I sit at my desk and I go to sleep. Sometimes never even taking leave of my pajamas. So,
you mean while you're walking?
Well, yes. That's why I'm known in my neighborhood as the parasite. And the only male in rural Japan who doesn't put on a suit and go out to his office and
I hope your pajamas aren't pink that you walk around the neighborhood. They know who you are.
They know who I are, whatever the color of the pajamas. But, I mean, I think writing has been, in some ways, my way of stilling myself and clarifying myself. And I feel that, you know, nowadays I'm not sure if I'll write anymore for publication, but it doesn't matter, because what writing does for me is allow me just to sit still, to see past the delusions of the mind, to realize how every inspiration I have now is completely temporal. And this afternoon I won't even recognize the things I wrote this morning. And to take the bombardment of experiences that come in on me when I am traveling and try to put them within a kind of order. So I'm really grateful for writing, for being my, I suppose, clearing in the wilderness. And to go back just briefly to the meditation point, it's interesting. I mean, since we're sitting almost in the midst of Silicon Valley and one of the great distinguished universities of the world, I actually think the more busy you are, the greater is the need to sit still. And one thing that's really impressed me is that, in fact, it's people at Google and at Intel and right the way across this valley, the people at the forefront of technology who seem to be wisest about the limits of technology and about the need to unplug or maintain internet Sabbaths or clear your head in some ways. So,
well, I certainly think that we're having a movement here, but I think it's also becoming a global movement about, as we become more globalized and connected, there is recognition that we need to become more internal and disconnected,
exactly, yes.
Which is sort of an interesting paradox. You mentioned your father. So your father is from Madras, and I went to the University of Bombay, and then he went to Oxford, and he was one of the first Indian Rhodes Scholars?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, but he studied politics and philosophy and economics, and then he went to various universities, but ended up down at UC Santa Barbara?
Yes. There was a thing called the Center for the Studies of, do you know it? The Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, a think tank that was set up in Santa Barbara.
By Hutchins.
That's right. Yeah. Hutchins, the boy wonder president of the University of Chicago. I think he was president of Chicago when he was 29, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Something like that. And then he came up with this wonderful, entirely American, almost Californian idea of gathering some of the most interesting minds on the planet in this beautiful Italianate villa overlooking the sea in Santa Barbara, and just asking them to reconceive the city on the hill and think about a new republic and a new conception of the United States. So my father was lucky enough to be invited there. And I was lucky enough to be rescued from the cold, grey, rainy days in Oxford to beautiful California at a time when every little English boy had only one dream in life, and that was to be a Californian. So I sort of realized it thanks to my parents, and then got to enjoy that commute back and forth that you were describing earlier, and sort of seeing the way that cultures dream about one another and project their longings or their needs upon one another. Because I really did feel, when I was a little boy taking those flights between London and Los Angeles, so many of my friends in England really craved long horizons and freedom from the past and the sense of possibility that California still represents. And I think some of my neighbors in California seemed to be hungering for history and a sense of rootedness and the groundedness of ritual that England has in abundance. So I was lucky enough to be sort of emissary from each world to the other, or to pretend to be.
That reminds me of Madonna. You know, she's from California, but then pretends she's from English and
Yes,
comes up with an accent periodically, which I find sort of fascinating. And your mother was a religious scholar?
Yes. So, in fact, both my parents were really interested in religion. Essentially, comparative religions and philosophy was their subject. And that's why, when I was 2 years old in Oxford, England, we had this scratchy transistor radio on a shelf. And every night at 7 o'clock in the evening, my father would turn it on, and out would crackle this faint report from the highest mountains on the world about this young prince fleeing Lhasa in order to find a new life in Tibet. So that's how I first encountered the Dalai Lama, by listening to those reports in 1959. And as you said in your introduction, because my father was a philosopher, and because he was interested in other religions, and I think was one of the relatively few people who knew at that point that for the first time in all of history, this great repository of Tibetan wisdom was available to the world. So he sailed all the way back from Oxford to India and requested an audience with His Holiness in 1959 as soon as His Holiness arrived.
Oh, wow.
And His Holiness, I think the minute he arrived in exile, realized that, as you know so well, that exile would allow him to do many things he couldn't do when caught in the ritualism of old Tibet. So was eager to entertain any visitor who wanted to see him. And so he invited my father up to meet him, and they had a very good conversation. And nowadays, I remember how, at the end of that conversation, my father said to His Holiness, "Oh, you know, I've got this little 3-year-old boy back in England who's really interested in your story." And His Holiness, with that great gift for finding the way to communicate with whoever it is, 3-year-old boy or head of state, found a picture of himself when he was 4 years old, already on the lion throne in Lhasa, and sent it to me through my father. And so I had that picture on my desk from the age of 3, and then when we moved to Santa Barbara, it was still on my desk. And then this is the perfect kind of Buddhist punchline. Our house got wiped out in a fire, and I lost that picture. And I had to realize that the meaning of the picture was in the ideas that it represented, and not in the physical artifact. And it didn't matter that I don't have that picture, as long as the values for which it spoke were something still in my life.
You're sounding like a Buddhist.
Yes, well, I've been so grateful for the years in Japan, I think. Because I moved I was working for Time magazine in Midtown Manhattan, and I really had this life I probably had dreamed of as a little boy. I had this apartment on Park Avenue, and 25th floor office, 4 blocks from Times Square, and best job I could imagine, writing world affairs for Time magazine, most interesting colleagues, no responsibilities. I could take my holidays, and I did, in Burma and El Salvador and Morocco. But I felt that I was learning a lot about one side of life and not about another. And so I left all that in order to live in a monastery on the back streets of Kyoto. And although my stay in the monastery didn't last very long, I do feel that after 25 years in Japan, I'm trying to learn a little about what that culture has to offer in the way of matters of listening and attentiveness, and I think what you just said, how to deal with loss and reality and the facts of life, I suppose.
Now, did you meet your wife during that period in the monastery?
Yes, I did. Yes.
How many monks have fallen because of women?
You're asking much too salient questions, Jim. Yeah, so, as soon as I arrived in the monastery on the back streets of Kyoto, of course, I found a Kyoto monastery is very different from what you imagine in Midtown Manhattan. It's not just a matter of contemplating the moon and writing haiku. It's a matter of scrubbing floors and washing dishes and sweeping lawns. So my year in the monastery only lasted a week. And then I told myself, with a bit of truth, well, I can go to McDonald's and department stores and learn about Buddhism there from the way it invisibly permeates Japanese life. And actually, it's a kind of silly thing you say when you're in your 20s, but now, many years later, I think there was some truth to it, because the Japanese, I think, are not approaching Buddhism in a textual way or scriptural way, but in a very practical, day-to-day way. But so, yes, and then my first week there, I stumbled into a coffee shop, and there was a quiet person making sketches in a plaid shirt on the other side of the table for me, and he asked me where I came from, and I said Santa Barbara, and he lit up, and he said, oh, by chance, I went to UC Santa Barbara. Have you ever heard of somebody called Mrs. Iyer? My mother. And so I bumped into a former student of my mother's who actually had been living the Zen life for 15 years already when I met him.
You mean she didn't leave in a week, or he didn't leave
He
in a week?
didn't, no. He was sensible. He met a Zen teacher in Santa Barbara and decided he would go and study with that teacher, but it took him 4 years to get there. And he traveled for 2 years overland from San Francisco through Afghanistan to Kyoto. So actually, when he was there, he was rid of all his illusions, unlike me flying straight from Midtown Manhattan. So he was much wiser by the time he got there, and so he instantly found his life, but he very kindly took me in tow. And so my third week there, a Zen master who was a friend of my friend Michael's was having an initiation ceremony, and he kindly invited me as his guest, and there was a little room set aside for foreigners, and next to me was a Japanese woman who was clearly a foreigner at heart, but deeply Japanese. And so my year of living in a monastery turned into a year of watching my Japanese now wife completely transform her life. Because when I met her, she was married with 2 kids. But she had met an American woman who was studying Zen, teaching English, and living as a single mother with 2 children in Kyoto. And my wife, Hiroko, thought, well, goodness, if an American woman can make a destiny for herself and do such an adventurous thing so fearlessly, why cannot I? Because she was in a marriage that wasn't satisfying her, and she'd always had these dreams of doing more spirited things that engaged with her talents. But in Japan, there was and still is not so much scope for that. So as dramatically as Japan transformed itself after the war, and having lost to our country, decided to remake itself, so she, overnight almost, remade her life. And when I met her, she'd never really been outside her hometown of Kyoto. She'd never been on a plane. Within 1 year, she was a tour guide, leading even more bewildered Japanese around the world. But she just decided, well, I can script my own destiny, and she did. So yes, my life in the monastery turned out to be a life watching Japanese discipline and application and brightness in action.
Now, did you speak Japanese at that time?
Well, one embarrassing question after another. I've only been there. I've only been there 25 years, and I can't speak Japanese.
Well, that's what I.
Yeah, no, that's what you thought. Yeah, in fact, I spoke more of it then when I arrived than now. And again, I tell myself, I rationalize it by saying, well, I want to learn about silence from Japan. I want to learn about nonverbal communication, and I hope I've learned a bit about that. But in the process of learning a lot about that, I haven't learned Japanese, no. And it's surprising to many people because my wife, now we've been together 25 years, and she speaks quite limited English, and we've never had communications problems, I genuinely feel. And I often tell my friends, and it sounds flippant, but it's not, that I genuinely feel I have more serious communication problems in Santa Barbara than in Japan, partly because of the illusion of the common language, but also I think, you know, because you've been to Japan, haven't you? They're so good at listening, and they're so good at reading cues. And they're so comfortable with everything that's not said. So that I think if you go on a date in Japan and you go with your beloved to a movie, the ideal date is you both watch the movie, you take it in, you're deeply moved by it, and then you silently go home. And I think in this culture, there's always a sense we want to talk it out, and we want to compare our analyses. But their notion of sharing things in silence is much deeper, I think, and speaks for a much deeper communion than the word or the mind can admit you to. So I really feel I enjoy great communication with her, mostly thanks to her. And I've never run into something that I want to communicate to her that I feel I can't. And I love the process of speaking English simply or another language very badly, because I think it purifies you and clarifies you, and it becomes a matter of communication. My emphasis is entirely upon carrying the meaning from my heart to her heart. I'm not trying to bedazzle her with words. I'm not trying to befog her with words. I'm not even noticing what the words are. And so I think it becomes a much more transparent kind of dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems more pure. I mean,
Much,
it's direct.
exactly,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us try to be additive so much to think we're giving better expression to an idea, and oftentimes it's more confusing. Is my wife? Oh, there's my wife. And my son back there. I wonder if she was there before I said something, so now I can't say it. My wife likes to talk, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, my wife does too. It's just I can only understand 60% of what she says.
Well, my wife's Russian, so I can understand. When she's mad, I can understand about 5% of what she says.
But you can understand she's
No,
mad.
no.
Yeah.
I don't need
right.
to even understand the Russian words to know
Yeah,
what she's talking
exactly.
about.
That's a
Usually, when she's
perfect
mad.
example,
When she's
yeah.
mad. So, but we won't go there right now, or I'll get into trouble.
Well, I'll save you by saying, I mean, one of the things I think most of us in this room know His Holiness, and I know he's been to Stanford many times. And one of the things I love about him, which I know you've spent so much time with him, is his pragmatism. And every time he comes to Japan, he comes every year in November for 7 to 10 days. And I and my wife spend all those days absolutely by his side. So, of course, we attend all his lectures, but we also sit in on all his closed-door meetings and have lunch with him. And it's a wonderful way to be exposed to his wisdom. And at the end of every public lecture he gives in Japan, somebody will put up a hand and very kindly ask a question about, please, will you tell us how to lead our lives better? And I think they're expecting him to say, exercise compassion, or think about the long term, or practice kindness in your daily lives. He always says, one thing, learn English. And that's the one piece of advice he always gives to the Japanese. And as with everything he says, it's rooted in something fairly profound, because he feels that the Japanese have such a sophisticated society and so much technology and education, but they can't share it with the rest of the world because of their linguistic gap. And he's always urging the Japanese to travel to the more materially impoverished parts of the world to share their resources, but they can't because they don't speak English. So the one thing he says over and over to them is, please speak English. And in fact, 2 years ago, we were traveling with His Holiness's younger brother, who is also an incarnate Lama, and we were spending a lot of time, every night we'd have
TC?
dinner with him. Yes, TC, Nari Rinpoche, as he is officially. Yes. And so again, my wife at the end of the week said, well, could you tell me, because he's really a teacher, what instruction you have for me? And he said, you speak atrocious English. Please learn to speak it better. But I said to her, well, that means you've passed, because he wasn't finding any fault with her character. I think he really was saying, oh, you've got yourself psychologically and emotionally in good shape. It's just this practical thing you need to attend to. So it's lucky he doesn't know I can't speak Japanese.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about how he gets to the point. He, like many of these individuals who spend a great time with introspection, I think they can read people very quickly, and they can know, I think, your heart very quickly. It's interesting. I was with him recently, about 3 months ago, in Mungad. I don't know if you've been there.
Never been there,
It's
no.
the Tibetan refugee camp in southern India, but we spent some time together. But I was talking to him about something, and I was going to start explaining the purpose of what I was going to ask him, actually. And he put his hand on my knee, and he said, you never have to explain anything because I see your heart.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
Very sweet. Yeah. So it was extraordinary. Now, I want to talk about theosophy. Do you have an interest in theosophy? I know your parents did.
Yes.
And I say that because Krishnamurti, I am a fan of Krishnamurti. So.
Well, I was lucky enough to hear Krishnamurti a couple of times in Ojai,
Really?
just down the road from Santa Barbara, of course. So my parents are both theosophists. And therefore, I think that's part of where their interest in comparative religions came and what I learned from them. But I haven't been. I've sort of gone my own way, and I give great credit to my parents for that generosity of sending me off to an Anglican school. And of course, they, growing up in British India, were both the products of Catholic education in India as well, and respected what you got educationally there. So I'm afraid, I'm not even a theosophist. I've done a good job of sort of not ticking none of the above so far.
We're getting there.
All right.
But I bring that up simply because I certainly think theosophy is interesting, and beyond that, I have found Krishnamurti interesting. Although I haven't had the pleasure of actually being with him or talking to him directly. But I do go up to his library in Ojai periodically.
Yes, wonderful library.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary. You've been called the Thomas Merton with the frequent flyer pass, I think is what it was said one time. Have any of you guys heard that before? But in many of your books, you talk about being in different places, interacting with culture, and one of the conversations in Video Nights from Kathmandu, I think, was this collision between East and West. And in fact, though, you said, while many people are angry about, if you will, the first world imposing itself on the third world, I think you made a comment, they don't know that the third world is hustling the first world. Remember that?
Yes, or else just that the riches are differently disposed. And I think, again, His Holiness has talked wonderfully about this, and the ways in which we in the West are probably materially more developed than many places like Nepal or Cambodia. And we go there because we feel they're more spiritually or culturally developed. And there's this interesting exchange, cultural exchange, and sometimes exchange of dreams and illusions and romances, but sometimes exchange of what each culture really has to offer to the other. So I did feel in those days that somebody like me who's grown up in the West was traveling to those places in search of antiquity and wisdom and everything we couldn't get in the time life building. And they were reaching for the things that our culture has in such abundance, which is modernity and material progress and opportunity. And I think it's like in any romance, really. There's always some transaction, and the transaction doesn't diminish the attraction between the parties, but each has something to learn from the other. And so, yes, and as I was saying, I think that really grew out of those early commutes I made between a very old world, my boarding school was set up in 1441, and a super contemporary world, Santa Barbara in 1968 with the Grateful Dead and the youth revolution exploding all around it, and what old and new had to share and to gain from one another. So yeah, I suppose that's been my theme since I was a boy because of the way that I grew up. And of course, I'm a curious example because I'm physically entirely of the East, but probably culturally entirely of the West. I don't speak any Indian language, and I don't speak any Japanese.
It's interesting you mentioned the Grateful Dead. I don't know if some of you may have attended. I gave the keynote talk at the Psychedelic Science meeting recently. And I won't ask you how I ended up there. But I came to give this talk, and it was funny because these are all the major researchers in the world working with psychedelics. And so when I gave my opening, I said, you guys invited me 3 months ago, and since I had never tried psychedelics, I thought I would experiment so I could really understand them before I came here. And, of course, I'm being facetious, and this guy in the audience goes, God, man, that is so cool. And then I opened my talk, actually, with a video of the Grateful Dead. And then after that video finished, I undid my shirt and pulled open my shirt, which was a Grateful Dead T-shirt. So I thank you for giving me that. And if you want to see that talk, it is somewhere online. What little I remember of that meeting. Although, and I have to tell you, after that meeting, it was extraordinary because I had all these people come up to me and they go, listen, man, we have an ayahuasca retreat every 2 weeks in Marin, and we would just love to have you come out to that. And then another guy came up to me and said, you know what I think you should do, Dr. Doty, is I think you should do LSD, and we'll do this thing for 4 hours, and then we'll switch you over to MDMA. And I'm like, are you serious? He goes, oh yeah, I do this every couple weeks. I'm going, so there you have it. I'm not sure if my mind could handle that much enlightenment, but anyway.
I was just on Telegraph Avenue not so long ago, and I was realizing how outdated my East-West schema that I just laid down was, because there, where in 1968 there would have been a deadhead shop selling the stuff of Nepal, there was a Nepali shop selling that. And I think if you go to Kathmandu now, there'll be somebody from the Bay Area selling iPhones or something.
Exactly.
So, and of course, Mickey Hart from the Dead was the one who brought the Tibetan monks over first, I believe. So,
strange.
Yeah, so in the 1980s, when I did my first book, there was really still a sense of great physical distance between the two, and so they could gaze at each other from 6,000 miles. And now my sense is that that dance of East and West plays out inside people, including, I'm sure, many of the students at this university who have parts of themselves significantly in the East and parts in the West and have to work out how it all makes sense.
But you know, one of the things I think, though, that is an interesting paradox is that, as you were pointing out, so many people go to the East hoping to find enlightenment. And of course, that's not where you find enlightenment, you find it internally. But that being said, here we have in the West this epidemic of isolation, depression, and loneliness. And we have these people from the first world wanting to come to the West for what you said, a better opportunity or material things. And yet, those cultures, oftentimes from the third world, are those that have the deepest spiritual or shamanic traditions that span thousands of years. And many of those people, even in their poverty, if they have shelter, if they have food, if they have security, are actually quite happy people.
Yes, yeah, and I've always cherished being an outsider because I think the one gift an outsider can bring to any place is a renewed sense of what it takes for granted, which are its own advantages. So when I was going back and forth as a little kid, I would arrive in England and I would see things that England has that anybody else would envy, and I would try to tell my English friends about it, and the same in California when I came back. I think initially your first question was about travel and the quest. And to me, the heart of travel is that moral question. As you're walking down the street in Phnom Penh or Port-au-Prince or wherever it may be, somebody comes up to you either with a hand extended or with a plea in his eye or her eye, please will you take me to California? And what do you do with that plea? Because you know that the California where she will end up is not the place she's dreaming of. And you know that a part of her may be happier in the cultures which make sense to her, but you also know that parts of her will be restless until she's had a chance to play out those dreams. And people like you and me are lucky enough that I can go to Japan and work through the illusion of my romantic Japan. But most people in the world don't have the chance to see head-on the places they dream of. And I think even President Obama's first book is really explicitly about that. He goes to Kenya, and all his Kenyan relatives ask him, take us to the land of the free. And he doesn't know what to do with that. And I love the way that travel dramatizes those questions. But as a traveler, so to speak, going, for example, between California and Havana now, everybody I meet in Cuba is somebody by definition who longs to escape. And so a small part of what I can give them is maybe a more realistic sense of what life is here. And the small thing that I can take back to my friends and neighbors in California is a more realistic sense of what Cuba is like. And that it's not a totalitarian hell and it's not a socialist paradise. It's a very human place playing out the same complications, as you were saying, that we all have within us. But Dharamsala is such an interesting example of that because, as most of you know, the village in the foothills of the Himalayas where the Dalai Lama lives, because most of the people you see there people like me who've come there hoping to find something we can't get at home. And most of the Tibetans there desperately want to come to this country. And all this takes place around the temple of a man who is saying just what you said. Enlightenment happens within. You can find what you need wherever you are right now, and that longing is in fact what keeps us further away from our content and settledness. And so I think His Holiness would tell both sides, well, just stay where you are, and then you'll find your happiness, rather than projecting it on an external.
I think that's the challenge that most of us have, is we project what we perceive as what we need and chase that versus becoming comfortable with non-attachment. And I think that's the hardest thing.
Yes, yeah. And it's very poignant there because, so many of my Tibetan friends from Dharamsala have come to this country, and I was just visiting one in New York. Very, very talented, resourceful, energetic young Tibetan woman who first fled from Tibet to Nepal, and then from Nepal to Dharamsala, and then from Dharamsala to New York. It's a very, very difficult life she has there, and my heart breaks when I see. But I think she needed to put her dream to the test. And of course, all her family, including her husband, is back in India, and she doesn't even know if she has a husband anymore because she's come to New York, and yet, yeah. So those are the conundrums you face.
No, I think though that you point out that this idyllic view that we create in our mind about wherever we're going to visit or what it's going to give us or what it contains, in some ways those possibilities are real, but the fact of the matter is real life plays out there too, with all its tragedies and pain, and I think maybe when you spend longer there, you actually see that versus going from tourist attraction to tourist attraction, where you are playing out that artificial, I think, vision sometimes, versus really getting down. And you speak of Cuba. I spent some time in Cuba, and I'm sure you'll agree. It is interesting how there is this romanticized view of America, although I think it's probably changed somewhat in the last few years, because I think it's not quite the land of milk and honey. Plus, what I have found interesting is that you talk to the people there, and while the Cubans who are in Miami, they believe that they're going to come at some point and run Cuba and that they'll be welcome, and the Cubans want no part of, because it's an interesting conundrum, because they have their own idealized or romanticized view of how it will be when freedom actually occurs, and it's certainly not going to play out that way.
No, it's a parable of longing, and multiple longings all converging in the same place, because we have dreams about what will happen post-Castro's, and those will not happen either. Every ship is romantic, but the one that we sail on. I think Emerson said that. And I think Emerson and Thoreau are my favorite travelers, and partly because Emerson said travel is a fool's paradise. If you hope to find anything abroad you couldn't find at home. And Thoreau, why travel around the world to count the cats in Zanzibar? I mean, just what you were saying.
But then that probably segues us into Graham Greene.
Good.
So you're a fan of his writing, obviously. You've just written your book, The Man Within My Mind.
Head,
Head,
yes.
Man Within My Head. And you actually admit that you read The Quiet American every year at least. Right?
Yes, because I think it's for those of you who haven't read it, it's a wonderful book about the American Empire, the British Empire, and Asia hovering between them, playing them off against one another. It's set in Saigon in 1952 when it was written, and it's about the British Empire realizing that its days of glory are over, mocking because it envies the young American Empire that comes into town determined to turn Saigon into a version of Harvard Yard. And the young Japanese, there was a Freudian slip, the young Vietnamese woman that both of them are in love with. But I think it's really a discussion about faith versus doubt, and about being old versus being young, because the middle-aged Englishman pretends and claims to have no opinions and no feelings, but you can tell that's a defense, really. And the young American is idealistic to a fault. He's almost too in love with the notion of being a gallant redeemer of the world. And I think, therefore, it's really about the debate that plays out inside any one of us between realism and romance. And I'm so glad you asked about the Graham Greene book, because my previous book was about the Dalai Lama. And I see them really as essentially the same book. And the Dalai Lama and Graham Greene coming at the same question from opposite angles. And it's funny to compare a man of palpable, visible goodness, like His Holiness, with a famous self-described sinner, like Graham Greene. But I think Graham Greene was always coming at faith through the back door, not starting from the position of a saint who acts badly, but starting with a very fallen man who, in the crisis, acts with much more compassion and selflessness than he even imagines of himself. The man, in other words, rising to his highest potential. And I think both His Holiness and Graham Greene are really talking about untapped possibility inside us. And I see them both as compassionate realists, because in both of them, certainly this is obvious in Graham Greene, but I think equally obvious in His Holiness, they've looked at the world attentively and discerningly and intensely, and they know the world in all its complication and confusion and brokenness, and yet they still hold out hope and confidence for it. And it's wonderful to have those two things in balance. Somebody who knows the world inside out and is undeluded about it, and yet who hasn't given up on it. And so I think that's what brought me to Graham Greene immediately after spending so many years writing about His Holiness, getting at the same question, that same vision of tempered confidence. And I think you've spent so much time with His Holiness too, but I think people who don't know the Dalai Lama, one of the things they may most underestimate about him is his realism, and he's so pragmatic. And that because he's been the leader of his people since the age of 4, he's never been in a position where he can entertain wishy-washy or romantic or abstract ideas. He has to come up with something that works in the here and now. And I think through history, we've been so lucky to have the wisdom of many monks from every tradition. But the great thing about the Dalai Lama is he's bringing that monastic wisdom right into the White House and complicated discussions with Beijing and the European Parliament, and having to exercise these very high ideals in the compromised, challenging reality of right now, where there are no good solutions. And I think that's a very exciting thing to be witnessing. And somehow I feel the same with Graham Greene.
You know, it's interesting, though, because I think many of the people, they see His Holiness, I won't say necessarily in his best light, but they have an imagination of him and a view that he never gets angry or loses his temper or actually breaks down. And it's interesting, I've seen both of those things occur, and I'm sure perhaps you have too. And it's interesting because I think there's so few people like him that being around him, in some ways you may even project your own view of this incredible person who's almost beyond a human. But when you see him get pissed off, you go, oh, well, I guess he's now, he doesn't use foul language like I do, but you can tell when he gets very perturbed. And then the other thing, I won't say it was an honor because it was quite difficult, but I think it was 2009, on the 50th anniversary of the exile, there was a monk who had immolated himself, and I was with him, and it was being played out on TV, and I saw him get extraordinarily emotional. So, in fact, he really does. Which
it's very moving to see him shed tears, as he does quite a lot. Yeah. And I think that humanity is really what anchors him, and as you know, that's what he always stresses. I remember we were once in a bullet train in Japan, and a journalist came in to interview him. And one of the first questions was, excuse me, Your Holiness, what should we do with the problem in the Middle East? And the Dalai Lama just looked at him and in that very kind way said, silly question. Because if he had the answer to that, he would have the answer to cancer and many other things. And he said, no, I'm just a human being, and I'm prey to the same sorrows and the same angers and the same challenges as you. And I think that's what's so hopeful about his message, and of course about the Buddha's message. Although I'm not a Buddhist, it's essentially a reminder of our own possibility, and that's what the Dalai Lama is. And by stressing his humanness, I think he's also saying that if you see kindness and attentiveness in him, which we both do, that's just a reflection of what's in you or me or anybody in this room. And that the Buddha was not a supernatural being. He was just somebody who decided to apply himself to realizing some of his latent potentials, which anybody can do at any time in any tradition, really. And that's why, it's so interesting. As a religious leader, the Dalai Lama's most recent book is called Beyond Religion, because his emphasis, well, of course, you work with him in the science, and I think one thing that he stresses about science is it's universal and ecumenical and has nothing to do with your religious background or lack of religious background.
And I think that's his view of ethics as well.
That's right. Yes, right. I think he says secular ethics based on scientific findings is what he really wants to share.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because I think I've shared this before, but I'm an atheist, so I don't have a belief, and apparently you're almost there. But it's extraordinary because His Holiness embraces you regardless, and I think, and there's never a cell, but I think he really does believe, and I think in some ways you're actually saying this in the work you do and who you are, is you don't need any system except being kind, and I think that's what the science bears out, and I think at least that's how I try to function.
Yes, I mean, I think in that last book he says that religion is like tea. It's a wonderful thing that adds savor and luster to life. But as you said, kindness and secular ethics are like water. That's the necessity without which we can't live. So it's wonderful if you have the add-on of religion, but the first thing to really address yourself is to kindness and responsibility to the people around you. And I was just thinking about him a lot yesterday, actually, because it's Mother's Day. And so I took my mother out, and then for dinner we took out another mother who had just lost her sister. And then I remembered His Holiness always says, it's only kindness if it's extended towards somebody you don't like. It's too easy. I love my mother. It's not hard for me to try to be kind to her, but it's much harder for me than the people who are difficult to in my life, or their colleagues or bosses or whatever it might be. And that's where the compassion really comes in. And it's, I think all the religious traditions say that. But he's got a very good gift for speaking across religious lines, as you say.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have an intervention that's been developed by, Jinpa, of course. And
yes.
he actually, believe it or not, spent a week a month for 3 years with me here at Stanford. Can you imagine? And part of that was actually the development of an intervention or compassion cultivation training. But as we were just talking about, one of the most difficult things is extending your circle of compassion. And this is one that people struggle with for years because, like you were saying, well, maybe not all mothers, but most mothers, everyone loves their mother. But yeah, it's how do you maintain that sense of an open heart to those who actually you feel great anger or hostility or who just frankly don't like. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges, and I think that's one of the difficulties for so many people that leads to so many tragedies in the world.
Yes, and I mean, as you were saying that, I was just remembering another train ride I took with His Holiness. And I just found in a book, Mao Zedong had written in the margins of a book, if it's white and I say it's black, it's black. If it's up and I say it's down, it's down. If it's right and I say it's wrong, it's wrong. In other words, reason be damned, what I say goes. So I cited this because I just discovered it to His Holiness. And he grabbed my arm and he said, never say anything bad about Mao Zedong. You can always find fault with the actions, but never with the person. Because the actions are in the past and they're remediable at some level. But the person, potentially, though Mao Zedong is no longer living, is still in the process of growing. And again, I was so touched. Mao Zedong, the man who tried to destroy Tibet, who seems to us to be His Holiness's greatest enemy, who's made his life a misery, who's removed him from his own people for 52 years and decimated so many of them. But he wouldn't even allow me, a disinterested party, to say a single thing against Mao Zedong. I thought, gosh, that's compassion towards the seeming enemy.
That would take a little bit of time, I think. Though, there's a saying among neurosurgeons, which is often wrong but never in doubt. So it may be similar in some way.
I like that. I'm going to have to live with that for a while.
Actually, I'm just looking at the time. I think it might be time to maybe have some questions if you're...
Oh, absolutely.
So anyone who has any questions, question for you that popped in my head. I'm sorry, I'm stealing this from somebody else. I mean, taking somebody's question. But I heard a conversation you were having one time regarding the present book about how in some ways this relationship might have a connection to your own relationship with your father. And then how many of us, when we're young, we try to distance ourselves from being our father, and then we wake up and we look in the mirror and we are. Maybe you could just comment on that process.
Yes. So the book is a bit about my father and about the alternative fathers we all have, that the father who created us and the father we create in our heads to meet certain imaginative needs. In my case, Greene, who, as you were saying in your introduction, is indeed a virtual father. I never met him. And we create counter-parents to be the opposite to the parents that made us, but we can't run from our blood and our ancestry and our DNA, and we are probably mostly... So there's a man within our head that we create, and there's a man within our blood who made us. And to some extent, we're always defined by the dialogue between them. And Greene was a perfect example, because when he was 16 years old, he ran away from his boarding school, partly because his father was headmaster. And he was apprehended, but remarkably for that time and that class, his parents sent him to live with a wild Jungian for 6 months when he was 16, and the Jungian's dangerously glamorous wife. And for all those months, his only obligation was to tell his dreams every morning. And so he grew up really with these competing, feuding fathers, the headmaster and the Jungian. And all his books are about that dialogue. And I think one way or another, most of us have a variation on that theme. And I suppose I was addressing also that double standard, whereby if you meet a young woman or not so young woman and you say, you're just like your mother, she will get very irked. And if you say, oh, you're just like Virginia Woolf, she'll probably feel very flattered, even if her mother is more talented, more brilliant, and more gracious than Virginia Woolf. But we feel that we need to define ourselves, and that itself is a kind of folly or delusion, I think, but one we have to play through.
out, yeah.
Well, that's an easy one. So for those of you who can
You should
share
buy them all immediately.
I was asked what book of mine I would recommend, and there's only one, actually, so it's easy, which is the one about my meeting my wife called The Lady and the Monk. And I think that's the closest to my heart because it's my discovery of the woman I live with, it's my discovery of the culture in which I live, and it's her story. And I think her story maybe speaks for a lot of Japanese women, but maybe for a lot of women who want to define themselves outside the prescriptions of society. So it's long ago, that book. I wrote it 26 years ago, maybe, but it's still the only one that I would inflict on anyone.
Speaking of inflicting books, what book are you reading now, or what author?
Well, just on my way here, when Emma picked me up, I was telling her about a book called The Yellow Birds that some of you may have read. It's just out in paperback, and it's by a young man who served as a machine gunner in Iraq from, I think, 2005 to 2009, and it's about the Iraq War, but from the perspective of a soldier who writes so searchingly and so hauntingly in such a vulnerable human way. And it's his first book, and yet he writes as if he's been writing all his life. So it really knocked me out, and it's an allegory about what we all do when we're faced with things we don't understand, and we're not at home in our homes, and we're not at home in very foreign countries, and yet we have to make a life in the midst of that.
Are you a fan of David Foster Wallace?
Mixed. I knew him a little, and he was one of the kindest and funniest people I met. And I love the way he dramatized and expressed the condition of so many of us in this country now, which is longing for an earnestness but caught in TV culture. And it's sort of a variation on some of the things that I have addressed. And I just read the very good biography of him by D.T. Max. I thought you might be asking whether I'm a fan of Dave Eggers, and I'm a huge fan of his. And one of the other books, funnily enough, just this afternoon, I got an email asking me to recommend books to people. So you've just asked the perfect question. And the first that came to my mind was a book called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, also just out in paperback, by a woman called Catherine Boo, who lived for many years in, I suppose you'd call it a slum, right next to the airport in Mumbai. Fearless research, and she tells stories that are just shamingly real and powerful. And I don't know Mumbai very well, but my mother was born and grew up there, and is a harsh critic of things written about Mumbai, so I gave it to her, and she said, yes, this is just extraordinary. That this woman who is a Swedish-American and suffering from health problems of her own first put in the really hard work of living in this grueling place that I would be scared of going to, and then came out in a very calm and compassionate way with stories that we would never otherwise hear. And I think when I read a book like that about a difficult settlement in Bombay, I think I'm reading about Jakarta or Lagos or Sao Paulo, or really the global city. I think probably 3 billion of our global neighbors living in conditions like that, but it's rare that we get a chance to see or even to hear about them. So it came out, it won almost every prize in the country, and it should have won everyone. In fact, my Greene book was nominated for a prize in England, and this book was nominated, and I wrote to the prize givers and said, please, if you don't give it to her, it's a crime against human nature. And they wrote back saying, really, a crime? And they gave it to a book, I think, about Stravinsky, but not her book. But I was really disappointed, but it's a wonderful book.
Interesting. Next question.
Hello?
Hello.
Am I heard?
Yes.
Okay. In the very beginning of the conversation, Mr. Iyer made a statement that if you find the home inside, then the geography doesn't matter. I think that was the essence of all this conversation. I also, in the beginning of my career, my life, went searching for something out in the world. And I searched here, searched there, traveled all over the place, and didn't find anything. Till something told me that the search has to be inside. And when I found that something inside, call it home, call it Atman, call it creativity, call it whatever, once you find that home, then an integration takes place. The destination and the starting point become one. And the journey becomes a virtual journey. In that home, there is, you referred about stillness. In that home is stillness and silence. And when you find that home, then you find that the world outside is not very different from this home. I have come to realize, for instance, that half of me is inside. Though I am showing it here, I don't know whether it's here or here or here. For an intellectual, it is here. For an emotional person, it is here. For a passionate person, it is here. For a physical traveler, maybe in the feet. But anyway, somewhere inside. And once I found that, then I found that half of me only is inside, and the other half is outside. In Indian thinking, they say, this is the karta, and this is the karma bhumi. This is the field of action. The doer is here, and the field of action is there. This without that is incomplete. That without this is incomplete. So once that realization comes, then this stillness and silence finds its expression in the world outside. By traveling, by speaking, and we heard a lot of that from Mr. Iyer in the later part of his, the stillness was coming out in a torrent of words. But what I was listening to most of the time was not the torrent of the words. He was too fast for me. I didn't understand much of what he was saying.
I didn't either.
But I was with that silence. I was with that one sentence, that once you find the home here, then the geography doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. Next question.
Oh, could I just expand a bit on
Sure,
that?
sure,
Because
absolutely.
Thank you. That was so beautifully said, and you couldn't have expressed, I think, what I and probably many people here feel better. And in fact, when you asked about my spiritual practice, the reason I dodged it is that, so for 23 years, I've been spending much of my life in stillness and silence in this monastery in Big Sur. And it's interesting to me because it's a Catholic hermitage, and I'm not Catholic. And I'm the opposite to a religious person. I'm a journalist. And yet, I've been fascinated by the way in which stillness will awaken anybody to real life. And as soon as I went there, I felt, well, this is real life, and everything else is kind of a show. And the hard thing was, not how do you exile yourself from the garden, but how, if you can't live in a monastery, how do you make the monastery live in you? And how do you bring that clarity and stillness into the commotion of the world, which is what I think the Dalai Lama was doing. So it's interesting. Tomorrow, I'm actually going, that order is celebrating its 1000th anniversary. And
Wow.
I'm going to be talking to them. And I was very grateful that they would invite me as a non-Catholic to talk about how Meister Eckhart, one of the great mystics, said, there's nothing so close to God as stillness. And whether you call it stillness or whether you call it God or Atman or whatever, that's essentially the core of most people. And it's interesting how in that core is the place by definition where you don't make those distinctions. His Holiness is the same way. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a Buddhist or whatever. That's essentially the light around which you're organizing your life. So thank you very much.
I was just going to comment. It's interesting when I operate on people, on one hand, I can be very emotional, but on the other hand, in that arena, I have to be absolutely focused and turn this into a technical exercise. But one of the things that's a gift of that is that before I actually start, you can be very deep into absolute silence and stillness for a period, which actually settles you to do this other exercise. But in some ways, that has been actually an incredible practice for me, at least. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking on the subject of stillness, we have so much information coming at us, so much noise, so much visual stimulation and overstimulation. I understand that you managed to disconnect a lot from, and I'm wondering if you would discuss that. You mentioned receiving an email earlier, but I understand also that there are periods where you completely are not attached, to cell phones and things. I'd be very interested in hearing, this paradox in your
Yes.
life.
Well, again, here we are in Silicon Valley, and I think all of us feel that technology has made our lives so much better, longer, healthier, brighter. But the one thing technology hasn't given us is a sense of how to make the best use of technology. And I think you have to go offline to develop the wisdom and emotional clarity to know how to go online. So that's, again, my justification for mostly being offline. So yeah, I've never used a cell phone in my life, and I've never missed using one, though it's getting hard to find public phones, but it's still possible. And we functioned happily without cell phones 18 years ago. And when I moved from Midtown Manhattan, the place where I live in rural Japan, apart from not having any means of locomotion, no TV, I can understand, there's no printer, there's no high-speed internet, and there's no media. And so for many people, it's surprising for a journalist to try to be following or writing about the world, and he's not actually getting any of the latest events coming in. But I feel that it's more I can understand what's going on in Afghanistan by reading Graham Greene, or I can understand what's going on with my mother as she ages by reading King Lear, or I can understand what travel is about by thinking about Emerson or Thoreau. And that so much of the time now we're standing 2 inches away from the world, so we're getting it in all its excitement and immediacy, but it's like standing next to a painting. You can't begin to see the larger picture, or you can't really begin to see the shape of things, and it's only by standing a long, long way back that you can. So having come from my position in the Time Life building, where the news was juddering out every second, I felt, well, to understand the news, I have to be on the other side of the world without access to the latest. And it's amazing living in this media blackout as I do. I don't really feel I'm missing out very much. So I come back every 3 months from Japan, and I fly back to San Francisco, and then I have an hour layover before flying back to my mother's house in Santa Barbara. And in that hour, I go to the Hudson News and I read the magazines. And usually, my sense is that for 3 months, CNN and Time Magazine and the New York Times has kept everyone in a permanent sense of desperate agitation, breaking news, latest blog, et cetera, et cetera. And I come back after 3 months and really nothing's happened. Or I can catch up in 1 hour and without having been kept in that artificial state of frenzy. So no more is happening in the world than happened 20 years ago. And for 3 months we'll have been hearing about whether Hillary Clinton's going to run in 2016 or not, or what we're going to do in Iran, but go away for 3 months and come back, and it's the same question with the same uncertainties, and nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So I suppose the more I've been in the media, the more I'm happy to live without the media, and the more I suppose I could see its limitations. So I've worked really hard to try to keep my distance from the moment, I suppose. And I think also because traveling into stillness made me realize that I was only understanding my life when I was stepping out of it, and I was only finding what I cared about most when I removed myself from the commotion of the moment. And that I could only make my best decisions when I was in absolute stillness, not when I was running from the last email to the next appointment. So my bosses asked me to have email, and that's the one form of communication I have, but it's good. I mean, I owe it to them because they're employing me, and I need to have some way of communicating with them. But beyond that, I'm embarrassingly illiterate.
Yes.
Hi. I was going to ask you about what you learned from your mom, but I want to change the question. What is it that you're learning about your mom reading King Lear, you said?
The difficulties of old age. And, this is the age of people living longer than ever, and much of the time, Jim should really be talking about it because he's the doctor here. But I think
they said because I'm so old. Well, thank you, Pico.
But I'm guessing, a lot of people are living for a long time with pain or not functioning at 100%, and their loved ones who were never trained for it are having to care for them. And when they run into anger or flight from reality or confusion, there's a lot of great material now about Alzheimer's and dementia and those things, but there's a lot of wisdom in Greek classics, I think, or in somebody like Shakespeare who saw deeply enough into the human condition that the more I'm surrounded by old people and the older I get myself, the more I get out of King Lear every time I return to it. And I'm not surprised by those sudden fits of rage that he falls into, and I'm not surprised by his capriciousness, and I'm not surprised by the way he treats so badly the one person who loves him, and I'm not surprised by Gloucester, walking blind, being tended to by his son as he's lost all sense of bearing. I mean, all those things are archetypal, I think. And sometimes go more to the core than, again, the latest article in Time magazine about.
As many of you already know, though, old is always at least 15 or 20 years older than whatever age you are. So, yes, sir, this will be our last question.
I think I read one of your books a while ago about your travels through China when you were younger. And even if it wasn't your book, it was, I wanted to get your perspectives on China now and kind of where you see.
I think that's Vikram Seth.
Oh, was it Vikram? Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, and I was also going to claim credit for Mark Salzman and Peter Hessler, two wonderful books, Iron and Silk and The River Town. I wish I'd written, but not I. But you wanted my perspective on China.
Yeah.
So I haven't spent that much time in China, but and it's a difficult and impenetrable country for me, but I'm really moved by the humanity of the people there. And when we talk, as we have been doing in part, about our looking for some sense of guidance or sanity or clarity in the world, I feel that the Chinese people are in that condition times 10 because they've been denied all official religion for 60 years. And being human beings, they cry out for some kind of ancestral wisdom. And so I'm always moved that the last time I flew to Lhasa, for example, I think 90% of the people on the plane were Han Chinese. And some of them were going there because it's like Alaska or Hawaii, it's the Wild West. But many of them were going to seek out Tibetan teachers and Tibetan lamas and Tibetan temples and awakening to this wonderful fact that they have this ancient, deep, sustaining religion within their boundaries. And part of China now is this great place known as Tibet. And if people in California or Sydney, Australia, are going to Dharamsala or reaching out to Tibet for its wisdom, it makes more sense that people in China would be doing so. And it must be said again that when I travel with the Dalai Lama in Japan, always the most moving moments are when he has audiences with, I'm sure you've seen this, with Chinese people. And then, of course, since they can't see him in their own country, they fly to Japan, which is a lot of money for them. And often they're very, very ragged, and then you can tell they've used their life savings up just to see him. And when he walks into the room, they're sitting on comfortable chairs, and they all fall to the ground, and they begin sobbing, and they begin prostrating to them, and they're just rapt. And as soon as he's finished speaking, they all crowd around him just for his blessing or touch of him. And the first time I ever saw this, I thought, well, these are Tibetans. And of course, we know all the devotion that Tibetans bring to their leader. But they're all Han Chinese who are so devoted to the Dalai Lama and to his tradition that they will risk their lives and use all their life savings in order to enjoy just 45 minutes with him. And so it's always humbling to see that, and it's always a reminder that our black and white distinctions are only the abstractions, really. And that I think most Chinese people have more in common with Tibetans than apart, because they've been suffering under very difficult government and the vagaries of history that have been oscillating wildly for their entire lifetimes. So, as I say, I'm always moved by the Chinese people that I meet. The last time I was in Lhasa, I would say many of the kindest people I met were the Chinese, and many of the people I sympathize with were the Chinese soldiers who don't want to be there, don't want to be surrounded by a hostile culture, are very uncomfortable in that altitude and in those conditions, don't have a clue. They're like, soldiers anywhere often, but they've been told to go there, and they're in this very hardship posting. Official China is confounding to me. So I was in Shanghai 3 years ago, and I hadn't been there for 4 years. I really felt like a country bumpkin. 7,000 skyscrapers, each one lit in a different color. And when you drive through the dusk on the overpasses there, you feel you're in the year 2147. And I was coming from Japan, which is quite an advanced society, but I still felt I was in some futuristic psychedelic science conference, perhaps, that I didn't know what to do with. And then the next day, it dawned, so to speak, the sky was totally black. And people say, oh, you're so lucky, this is the brightest day we've had. You made a good choice to come in midsummer. And so, you both saw, I felt the Potemkin surface and a very harsh reality of the place. But that's on the official level. And I think the human part of China is always what has spoken to me more movingly. And it does come through, honestly, very, very well in the book River Town by Peter Hessler, who's covered China now very scrupulously and compassionately for 17 years, and Mark Salzman's book.
I think that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
That was a pleasure, Pico.
Thank you.
Hopefully we didn't put you under too much pressure.
No pressure.